Hello student, I am Professor Smitaja from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roorkee. Today I am going to discuss Victorian senses. Sensibility or senses very important during the Victorian time. So the 19th century sciences cleaved sensory experience into two separate realms, the bodily physics of sensation and the mental activity of perception. This division into two discrete categories was foundational to Victorian physics, physiology, and experimental psychology. Also, it was equally important to Victorian novelists, aesthetists, and critics. For Victorians, the distinction between sensation and perception promised the key to understanding literature's seemingly magical power to conjure up taste, sights, touches, and sounds from the austere medium of print. In Victorian literature, science, and philosophy, the parallel between reading and perceiving gave rise to momentous debates about description as a mode of knowledge, as well as how and even whether reading about the world differs from experiencing it firsthand. John Ruskin's claim in Modern Painters that error in judgment and perception arise from an excited state of the feelings underscore the complexities of sensory experience in Victorian literature. The connection between sensory perception and sensuality was a significant concern for many Victorian critics, as illustrated by the fleshly school of poetry debate. Robert Bouchan's critique of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poem Nuptial Sleep, which he dismissed as merely reflecting animal sensations, exemplifies the anxiety surrounding the perceived encroachment of sensuality in Victorian culture. In contrast, some Victorians viewed sensory experiences as a unique avenue for knowledge, offering insights unattainable through rational thought alone. William Cohen highlights this perspective in his analysis of Victorian literature, suggesting that for authors like Thomas Hardy, bodily senses are integral to understanding one's connection to the world. Similarly, Gerard Manley Hopkins regarded sensory experience as a pathway to divine understanding. Thus, while some contemporaries feared the implications of sensory perception, others embraced it as the profound means of engaging with reality. It is no surprise that opinions on the value and truth of sensory experience varied widely in the 19th century. During a time of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and growing democratization, the Victorian sensorium faced unprecedented challenges. As Staley Brass and White discuss in their influential work, The Politics and Poetics of Transgression, the rise of modern cities brought about a transformation of the senses. The lively, often chaotic streets of Victorian cities intensifies worries about social boundaries and segregation as new forms of visibility emerged. Questions arose about who was seen and who remained invisible in these public spaces, especially as transportation evolved. Urban residents found themselves grappling with how to respond, both morally and politically, to the realities that their senses were revealing. Stolly Brass and White also point out that tactile experiences became particularly complicated. In city life, the fear of being touched reflected deeper anxieties about contamination and disease, influencing how people interacted with one another in public. In more recent discussions, Stephen Arthur has examined how sensory experiences became a significant concern in late Victorian society. He references works like Max Noddu's Degeneration and George Simmel's essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life, highlighting how many late Victorian narrative dealt with the problem of sensory overload. People were bombarded with too many images, too much noise, and an overwhelming amount of information, which often led to nervous breakdowns and various forms of dysfunction. Examining the senses in Victorian literature reveals significant social changes during this period, including urban growth, advancements in transportation and communication, shifts in production methods, and the emergence of new leisure activities and popular culture. Thomas Carlyle campaigned against street music, and his desire for a soundproof study are particularly intriguing in this context. Known for his strong dislike of all kinds of noise, from piano playing nevers to crowing roosters, Carlyle was not alone in his frustration. Many others, including doctors, clergymen, academics, artists, and craftsmen, voiced their complaints about street noise, even if they couldn't afford a soundproof space. Street music and the broader urban culture posed unique challenges for the rising professional class. Unlike established professions with designated workplaces that affirmed their status, these newer professionals often found themselves navigating a noisy and chaotic environment. For instance, Georgiana Burne Jones noted that her husband, Edward Burne Jones, never joined the outcry against street organs, highlighting how artists like him could separate their creative spaces from the tumult of urban life. Overall, they struggled to maintain a contemplative existence amid sensory overload and evolving social identities was a complex task for many Victorians. David Sweeney Coombs, in his book Reading with the Senses in Victorian Literature and Science, explores the mechanics of reading to suggest new ways of thinking about Victorian literature in sensual terms. Coombs writes, consider, reader, how many words are reaching you now? Most likely, you are seeing them as your eyes scan lines of text on a page. Coombs also states that a series of rapid eye movement allow to fixate letters in line with fovea, the small indentations in the center of our retina. What happens to the reader next is more controversial. This is discussed by many 18th century philosophers, including Thomas Reid. According to Reid and others, the sensations, such as the black and white printed letters we see on the page, come together in the mind to form perceptions. That is, more complex ideas generated by an accumulation of sensations. Reid even likened this process of reading. When we perceive things, we are simply reading the book of nature, which common sense tells us to be a true. Coombs relates how 19th century psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers cast doubt upon Reid's theory, drawing on their greater knowledge of the human nervous system. German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz, for instance, conducted visual and auditory studies that shows how difficult it is for humans to consciously focus on a single sensation or stimulus. In one such experiment, he demonstrated that what we typically hear as simple tones are, in the fact, that complex harmonic result of multiple tones layered on top of one another. His conclusion suggested that our sensation at any moment are necessarily belated, fragmentary, and incommensurate with our conscious experience of the world. Helmholtz argued, in fact, that perception may precede sensation, especially in the case of language, where acquired experience is necessary to interpret a series of sounds. Taking Helmholtz's work one step further, American psychologist William James stressed the difficulty of differentiating between sensations and perception, thoughts, and things. During any experience, James writes, it is so hard to tell what part comes through the sense organs and what part comes out of one's own head. Sensations and perceptive ideas fuse here so intimately. James' uncertainty prompts an existential crisis as it becomes difficult to tell what part of sensory experience is real and what is supplied by one's imagination and prior experience. These Victorian scientific and philosophical debates about sensation lie at the heart of Coombs' inquiry, which examines the significance of Victorian literature and more recent literary theory. Coombs likens his book to Nicholas Dame's influential volumes, The Physiology of the Novel, Reading, Neural Science, and the Form of Victorian Fiction, which traces a previously lost strand of Victorian novel theory based on 19th century physiology. There are definite similarities between the two projects. Both Dames and Coombs aim at restoring reciprocity into the relationship between literature and physiology by using the methods of Victorian science to decode literature of the period. Both include canonical realist novels among their examples. For literary scholars, Coombs' book Imply demonstrates how 19th century debates about sensory perception influenced Victorian novels and recent critical theory. His chapter 2 notably suggests that Eliot's Romola anticipates philosopher John Groth's distinction between knowledge by description and knowledge by acquaintance. This was distinction between verbally mediated knowledge versus direct sensory experience, and it preoccupied scientists and philosophers like Helmholtz, James, and Eliot's common law spouse, George Henry Lewes. Coombs argues that historical fiction in general and Romola in particular pushed knowledge by description to its limits to evoke bygone times. The knowledge by description also evoked places such as Quattrocento, Florence, sometimes producing quasi hallucinatory effects. Chapter 3 of Coombs' book traces the theories of Alexander Bain, John Ruskin, and James in Hardy's The Return of the Native, where blindness and sensory deprivation trigger destructive trains of associative thinking. In the field of 19th century studies, however, touch and other sensory modalities have been largely overlooked by an emphasis on the visual in recent years. Jonathan Carey's 1990 study, Techniques of the Observer on Vision and Modernity in the 19th Century, is particularly groundbreaking in this respect. Carey's study reappraised the moment at which the classical Renaissance model of vision ruptured and modernist visual culture emerged, locating this systematic break in 1820s and 1830s rather than 1870s, which was previously accepted, and 1880s when Impressionism emerged. Carey's thesis importantly aligns Impressionist paintings with the development of photography as part of modernization of vision bound up in new type of observer. Via Foucault, Carey stresses that this observer was produced by a new set of relations between the body, technology, and forms of institutional and discursive power that emerged in early 19th century, through which the subject became visible. The influence of Carey's work on literary and cultural studies of the period has been significant. Nancy Armstrong, in Fiction in the Age of Photography, where she has studied the relationship between photography and realism, states that Victorian fiction equated seeing with knowing and made visual information the basis for the intelligibility of a verbal narrative, arguing that photographic technology increased exponentially the separation of the senses that privileged seeing. Armstrong alludes here to Carey's insistence that the 19th century underwent a pervasive separation of the senses in which touch was dissociated from sight. This account of sensory separation has contributed towards a downplay of interest in the other senses and has obscured, as Hilary Fraser argues, the equivalently novel conceptualization of touch in the visual field that emerged in the 19th century. The theoretical traditions that have characterized material culture studies over the past few decades include the work of Christopher Tilley, who outlines the productiveness of adopting a methodological approach drawn from phenomenological theory, which focuses on material forms as encountered through the multiple sensuous and socialized subjective apparatus of our bodies: sight, sound, touch, smell, taste. Phenomenology, broadly conceived, is a science of the phenomenon, and in particular, how phenomena manifest themselves, and the mental acts concerned with experiencing them. In its distinction from the idealist return to consciousness, early 20th century phenomenologists placed emphasis on knowledge as embodied and experiential, and on the investigation into its mediation through the senses. Phenomenological analysis have also begun to permeate the study of 19th century culture. William Cohen's exploration of embodiment and the senses in Victorian literature draws on the insights of 20th century theorists George Berkeley, Merleau-Ponty, Gilles Deleuze, and Felix Guattari. It has opened up the ways in which Victorian writers attended to the experiential dimensions of the body rather than simply to its domination by overarching social formation. Cohen's study takes its lead in part from cultural phenomenology, a critical practice associated with Stephen Connor and Stephen Klukas, and which adapts phenomenological philosophy for cultural study. Frustrated with the ever position assumed in contemporary cultural studies, cultural phenomenology is an attempt to try to understand the materials of culture in themselves. Cultural phenomenologists seek a kind of permeability to the object of study, to open up a range of experience for thought from sensorial and affect to the forgotten objects of a culture. Yet, as Hilary Fraser has also recently suggested, as well as considering how phenomenologists might open up our objects of study, 19th century cultural and literary historians can also help identify the lineage of phenomenological accounts of embodiment. In her critique of Carreri's project, Fraser asked whether a valid alternative critical approach might be to trace the prehistory of Merleau-Ponty's multisensorial phenomenology. Indeed, a discussion of the post-impressionist painter Paul Cézanne's distinction of tactile and visual qualities, Merleau-Ponty suggests the prehistory to his project, as he acknowledges that it is only as a result of a science of the human body that we finally learn to distinguish between our senses. The term tactile imagination is itself drawn from 19th century aesthetic discourse, with the art critic Bernard Berenson first using the term in his 1896 study of Florentine painters. Berenson's argument draws on contemporary psychological discourse, which stated that sight alone cannot give an accurate sense of the third dimension. According to Berenson, the essential in the art of painting is somehow to stimulate our consciousness of tactile values so that the picture shall have at least as much power as the object represented to appeal to our tactile imagination. Replying to this, Fiona Candillon argues that Berenson is working within a Western philosophical tradition which separates mind from body and allies art and transcendence. But the discourses Berenson inherited were concerned with the slippage between mental and physical states and anxiety that was frequently articulated through a changing discourse on the nature of the tactile senses. Indeed, Berenson himself believed that the purpose of art stimulating the tactile imagination was to awaken our consciousness of the importance of the tactile sense in our physical and mental functioning, and thus, again, by making us feel better, provided for life than we were aware of being, gives us a heightened sense of capacity. Berenson was mainly interested in the tactile imagination as a historical phenomenon. a quality inherent in past artworks that was reinvigorated in the modern day viewer or beholder, and he did not evaluate the tactile creativity of his contemporary society. However, that scientific and creative exploration of the tactile was a dynamic part of 19th century life. In that age, an increasingly delineated touch sense enabled the articulated and differing experience of individual subjectivity, suggested the permeability of borders between self and the external world, and gave new meaning to the construction, handling, and exchange of visual media. William Cohen explores one particular aspect of this Victorian tactile imagination as it manifests through the relationship between people and environment in Thomas Hardy's Woodlander. Drawing upon recent insights from phenomenologically oriented affect theory, Cohen considers the slippage between the human and the arboreal in Hardy's work. He suggests that we read the people of the novel as trees and the trees as people, considering how characters fall along a spectrum and exhibit different aspects of trueness. Yet, this is not a reading that imposes recent cultural theory on Hardy's novel. Rather, Cohen considers how the novel can reciprocally shed light on the field of affect theory. Through his reading, The Woodlander, Cohen demonstrates how the tactile modality provides a point of entry into discussions of both affect and ecology, and for understanding the materiality of the human, whether that material is regarded in bodily terms or terms of its non differentiation from its environment. Cohen advocates for a critical practice based upon tactile ways of knowing in which ideas and things rub against each other rather than being set in opposition in the classical form of a visually oriented subject object dichotomy. His reading of the tactile imagination denaturalizes the textual subject, as the actions and states associated with touch involving contact, handling, and proximity merge the surfaces of characters with the arboreal objects they live and work among. Reading 19th century culture through the tactile also has particular implications for our understanding of subjectivity in the period. In particular, the body becomes a central site upon which 19th century commentators explore issues of both subjective agency through its capacity to reach out and touch others as well as be touched, moved, and manipulated in return. Alan McNee has focused on the cultural discourse surrounding a new sporting activity, mountaineering, which became popular the 1850s onward. McNee considers how an embodied rather than optical knowledge of the mountain landscape became crucial to climbers. Through an analysis of the mountaineering literature published in the period, McNee identifies a Victorian approach to mountain climbing from the mid 19th century. The Victorian approach was distinctive from its romantic predecessors through a more explicit emphasis on the satisfaction of physical activity and challenges as an end in themselves, rather than as a means to advance scientific knowledge. McNee connects this to shifting ideas around the body and sensory experience being advanced in psychophysiological discourses. He observes that mountaineering literature was not necessarily directly influenced by physiological or psychological research, although indeed many mountaineers were from scientific and medical background, but rather that the attitudes expressed by mountaineers were symptomatic of a milieu in which physical sensation was allotted an increasingly important role. Pamela Gilbert also wrote an article analyzing the relationship between will and touch in Dickens's David Copperfield. Gilbert's focus is on perhaps the most visible tactile appendage, the hand. In her article, Gilbert discusses two paradigms that emerge in medical and philosophical understanding of the relationship between hand and embodied mind. The hand as a kind of sensory orifice that form a conduit between inner and the outer worlds, and the hand as an instrument of the will. Gilbert observes how authors of this age used hands more extensively than ever for characterological purposes, and in an innovative reading of David Copperfield demonstrates how a character's psychological development relates to the way he can use his hand. For David, this manifests in a disturbing play of hands, often violent, in two profound struggles of will he recounts between his stepfather, Murdstone, and Uriah Heep. Like the theory of the tactile imagination, and the word haptic also came into being towards the end of the 19th century. Haptic perception, to borrow a contemporary definition from the Encyclopedia of Cognitive Science, is based on combined sensory inputs from the skin, muscles, tendons, joints, and mucosae exposed to the environment, and most commonly results from active, purposive touch. Significantly, haptic emerged out of 19th century psychophysiological investigation. Today, haptic signals a range of different sensory activities loosely cohered around the notion of active whole body touch and the interoperability of touch and sight, and the term is deployed as both a critical tool and a historical definition. Therefore, it can be said that the role of the senses in Victorian literature is incredibly important, as they provide a crucial way for authors to delve into the complexities of human experience and societal shift. During this period, rapid industrialization and urbanization reshaped how people experience the world around them. Writers like Charles Dickens and George Eliot masterfully used sensory imagery to capture the struggles of everyday life, connecting personal experiences to larger social issues. The senses allowed for a deeper understanding of class differences and moral challenges within society. Victorians were also caught in a struggle between rational thought and sensual experience, often questioning how reliable sensory perception was in an age increasingly influenced by science. This tension is reflected in their literature, which showcases both a fascination with sensory details and a critical examination of what those details mean for knowledge and morality. As a result, the literature of this era becomes a rich tapestry woven from sensory experiences, inviting readers to engage with emotional depth and social realities of the time. Conclusively, the exploration of senses in Victorian literature not only enhances our understanding of individual subjectivity but also reveals collective societal transformations. By engaging with sensory experiences, readers can better grasp the emotional depth and social realities that defined this pivotal literary period. With this, I wrap up the discussion. Thank you very much. I hope that you will be benefited by getting this course, knowing about the various shades of Victorian literature, and enriching your knowledge of English literature. Thank you very much.